Hello everyone, Flandre here. Today we're going to compare the FÉG HD-18 to the Tiger carbine. And the reason we're doing this video again is because I wanted to make this video a little bit more concise. The first video, I was going everything literally right then. That was the first time I was taking both rifles apart and comparing them. So it was a little slow. And during the time that I was doing that video, I believe that I left everything a little bit too open-ended. Thus the message that was apparently conveyed to the internet was not the message that I wanted to convey, which resulted in these huge conspiracy theories running wild. Myself and other forum members have gone over this rifle a lot more in detail since I posted that video. So we have new information, new things that we can look at, and we can really get a better detailed comparison between these two rifles. So that's the reason why we're going to do this video for the second time.
I have also just been informed by an insider that on Friday, the people involved with the distribution of these rifles essentially had teamed up with their lawyers and with the ATF, and they were able to go over all the paperwork, and they confirmed that everything here is good to go. There's no discrepancies, the proof marks and everything matched up, so all the conspiracy theories that you hear out there are really just that, just conspiracy theories.
So before we get into both these rifles, I'm going to really quickly go over the history of the SVD, kind of how the parts changed over time to where it is today, and then we'll see how the HD-18 essentially clones or mimics the Russian SVD in that manner.
Dragunov's rifle was put into service in 1963 as the sniper rifle System of Dragunov, model of year 1963, or SVD-63 for short. The original rifle had a 24.4-inch barrel with a twist rate of 320 millimeters. The only reason the original SVD had these specifications was because at the time 7.62 by 54R as a military round was only available as light ball ammunition, primarily used by machine guns. After the rifle was issued, the Soviet military realized the rifle suffered from accuracy issues due to their military-issued ammunition. So the Soviets developed the 7-in-1 spec 7.62 by 54R cartridge in the late 60s. However, in 1974, and some sources say this started around 1969, the twist rate of the SVD changed to 240 millimeters in order to allow it to shoot a wider range of ammunition more accurately, such as tracer rounds. I believe that they may have begun this in 1969 and fully transitioned in 1974, but it's unclear. Some sources just say 1969 and others say 1974, but knowing the way in which the Soviets kind of did things, it was likely a transitional period between 1969 to 1974. Prominent features of the SVD-63 model included ribbed Type 1 dust cover with deep indents on the back, lightning cuts on the external sides of the receiver, both left and right, laminated wood stock and handguards, and they had a full-body, thin-tail bolt carrier. We will talk more about how these were changed later. The SVD remained largely unchanged from 1974 to 1990. After the fall of the Soviet Union, however, most Russian weapon platforms saw huge upgrades. Many of these changes happened due to the experiences with firearms during the Soviet-Afghan War. Two new SVD models were issued in the 1990s, the SVD-S, which was a paratrooper side folio stock version, and the OTS-03, more commonly known as the SVU, which was a bullpup version. The SVU was not extensively used by the military, but rather ended up in service with the MVD, whereas the SVD-S was used and issued in full capacity to the Russian military as a paratrooper version of the SVD. Both of these models had shorter barrels. The SVU had a 20-inch barrel, whereas the SVD-S had a 22-inch barrel, as opposed to the fixed stock SVD-64, which had a 24.4-inch barrel. It should also be noted that the SVD-S barrel was thicker than the SVD-64 barrel. Around this time, the full-size military SVDs were also updated to use the polymer handguards that the SVD-S had. However, they retained the use of a wood stock until the late 90s or perhaps even the early 2000s, when they updated the stock to a polymer stock. The 90-era SVDs also saw a change to the dust cover from a Type 1 dust cover to a Type 2 dust cover, which was still ribbed but had a more shallow indent on the back of the dust cover. During the 90s, the bolt carrier also saw a major change, and the left side was lightened on one side to give a better bolt to carrier weight ratio. In 1993, the receiver saw a major change, removing the exterior lightning cuts. However, lightning cuts would continue to be made on the inside of the receiver. The tail of the bolt carrier was also extended during the 90s. Instead of having a thin-stemmed tail to prevent hammer follow, in the early 90s, the bolt of the SVD was changed so that the entire bolt extended more rearward to prevent the hammer from following forward. This simplified manufacturing of the bolt. In the late 90s to early 2000s, the SVD did see some more changes, including a new style top cover, which was smooth instead of ribbed, and they switched from a wood buttstock to a full polymer buttstock. So now the SVD had a full polymer furniture set. In more recent times, the SVD has been changed even more. In around 2010 to 2015, Russia was going through a lot of changes with their weapon platforms, including the SVD. And one of the changes they wanted to do to modernize it was to add things like rails and have the ability to switch between a fixed stock and a folding stock, which resulted in the SVD-M. The SVD-M would start off with a fixed stock receiver that could accept a folding stock or a fixed stock and a shorter 20-inch barrel. During the Chechen Wars, they found that repeated shooting with the SVD resulted in loss of accuracy with a longer barrel. However, they found that with the SVD-S, with a shorter barrel, quick successive shots were more accurate with a shorter, heavier barrel. Eventually, they would go with a side-folding receiver and only a side-folding stock, and a much thicker, shorter barrel, but with the combined front sight block and gas block in one unit, similar to what the AK-105 looks like.
So the first thing I'm going to go over is the Tiger carbine here. This is a sporterized version of the military SVD. It does have the military SVD main core features, including the slab side receiver, which was on the military SVD, and the ribbed dust cover that had the Type 2, that had the short indent as opposed to the long indent. This is a true proper post-93 SVD configuration. On the sporter versions, however, they had different furniture. This one has been converted into more or less military configuration, but on the originals, they had a sporterized wood stock and sporterized polymer handguards that didn't have ventilation holes. Another difference between the military version and the Tiger was the rear sight leaf. It had a 300-meter rear sight leaf as opposed to the 1200-meter rear sight leaf. Another major difference is the gas regulator. This Tiger has a gas regulator, as I've installed one. However, the originals that were imported did not have a gas regulator. It just had a gas tube. On the original imported Tigers, they had a neutered front sight block that looked like this. As you can see here, this one's stripped. I don't have the sight on the top here, but they didn't have the muzzle brakes attached like the military versions. The biggest thing was that the Tiger only had a 21-inch barrel. And this means that it's not the same length as the military fixed stock version. However, the OTS-03 did have about a 21-inch barrel, and the SVD-S also had a 22-inch barrel, which is more similar to the length of the Tiger barrel. The SVD-M also has a 21-inch barrel, roughly, similar to the Tiger. However, they do have thicker barrels, and the SVD-S and the SVD-M both have side-folding receiver ends. Because of this, the configuration of the Tiger it doesn't really fit in the line of military issue rifles due to its shorter 21-inch barrel. Now if we move on to the HD-18, you can see that I have changed the furniture out. I absolutely hated the disgusting civilian style furniture, but the original did have a sporterized buttstock. Well, it's very similar to the Russian military configuration, but it's got a lot of features that are very commercialized to make it more comfortable. It is longer, and overall I don't like it at all. Unlike military SVDs, these also have these ugly handguards that are supposedly M-LOK standard. I don't like them, of course, so swap them out for military furniture. And then up front here, we have this horrendous front sight block. It originally had a pin here and only a muzzle nut. There's threads that you can put a flash hider on that they've provided. And for the most part, that is the only difference between the HD-19 and actually a modern SVD. So it's a very nice clone of the modern Russian SVD because it has the correct barrel length. All the components clone the original SVD parts very well, and we're going to go into detail on that in a minute. But to convert this into a military SVD configuration, all you have to do is replace the front sight block and replace the furniture, and you're pretty much good to go. One thing to note about the front sight block, however, is I've gone ahead and removed it. There's 2 pins holding it in place like the normal one. The front sight block here, actually, the threads are attached to it. So that means if you want to use it for suppression, I wouldn't trust it. That's pretty much the only thing you would really want this for, is if you wanted to run some custom brake or maybe a blank fire adapter. That would be the only real reason I would see using this particular block. Otherwise, I don't think it's worth it. We can see here that it's actually cut for the correct spec. So you can actually press on a regular Russian front sight block easily. You can just hammer it down the rest of the way or use a press, but it's a good fit. That's normal for that. So with that out of the way, let's start taking these rifles apart. Okay, first thing we're going to look at here, I guess, is the safety selectors. If we compare the two, they're just about identical. The embossing and everything is the same, although you will see on the rear here that the FG-18 here on the bottom, the rear end is just a little bit different in profile. You can also notice kind of the perfilation on the bottom here. On the Tiger, it is like embossed, whereas on the HD-18, it's impressed. So those are the two main differences here. Is we've got impressed on the HD-18 and we have embossed on the Tiger. Now note, I've looked at modern ones, and the modern ones also have embossing like the Tiger. So at least from what I've seen, this is pretty unique to the HD-18 for the impressing. Next, let's look at the dust covers. This here is the Tiger dust cover. It is a regular ribbed Type 2. And this here is a modern Type 3 dust cover that the HD-18 has. It has a serial number stamped right here. And let's compare that to a Russian Type 3 dust cover. And we can see the profile and the stampings are about the same, which is very nice. It's nice that they were able to clone these so well. The rivet shape and everything else is perfect. Next, let's go ahead and look at the trigger groups here. So here we have the HD-18 trigger group. Here we have the Tiger trigger group, and here we actually have an original Soviet SVD trigger group. So let's look at the original first, because this is a little important and we'll get into it in a minute. But on the originals, we have something called a safety sear here. Now on the original SVDs, the Soviet SVDs, and many of the KBI imports, this was considered fine. The ATF approved them. They have the safety sears installed on those rifles, and there doesn't seem to be any issue with them. However, the Tiger imports did not have the safety sear installed. They were removed and were left with just this hole in place. This was also the case with the NDM-86 imports. They had the hole present, but they didn't have any safety sear installed. However, on the FEG-18 trigger pack, we actually have it welded over. Now, we don't really know the reason for this. We don't know if the ATF requested for this to be welded over, or if the importer was like, oh, that doesn't look good, and decided to just have it welded over as a safety precaution. You many times have importers essentially decide things for themselves just so that it can make it easier for importation and for less scrutiny with the ATF, and it's very likely that this here was the case as well. One thing on the fire control groups here we can see is different is the embossing on the mag release here. We see that the mag release on the HD-18 is much more pronounced than on the Tiger. I do have an SVD-S group here, and we see the SVD-S is much more embossed, it's much more sharp. So I believe that this is just basically a little more modern. This is a 2003. So very likely just early 2000s style that from their data packet that emulates over to the new style magazine release. Okay guys, so let's get a reading on these triggers, see what kind of pull we get. The SVD has a two-stage trigger. So there's the initial pull, it reaches a stop, and then there's the actual break. So let's go ahead and read that. Let's first read out the first stage. And on the Tiger, we are getting just around 1 pound on that first stage. Now let's read the full pull. And we are getting just about 2.5. So we have a 1 pull first stage and a 1.5 pull on the second stage. Okay, so now let's try the Soviet trigger group. Let's check the first stage. We have a 1 pound pull on this as well. And now let's do the full pull. And we have a 2.5 pull on that. So about the same as the Tiger right there. So 1 pull on the first stage and 1.5 on the second stage. So finally we get to the HD-18 here, its trigger group, and let's go ahead and see what we get here. So once again, these are 2-stage triggers. First stage we're reading 1 pound. And we got just under 2.5. So just a little bit better than the other two. Let's do another reading here. First stage, we're at about 1 pound at the first stage. Let's get a second stage reading in. Same thing. Just a little bit over 2 that time. So really nice trigger pull on that actually. That would be about, yeah, the full trigger pull is just under 2 pounds, or just over 2 pounds. So a little bit lighter than the Dragunov. So if that has a 1 pound pull on the first stage, the second stage is just a little over 1 pound as well. So that's pretty nice. Next up are the bolt carriers. So we see here, this here is the Tiger bolt carrier, and we can see the serial number right there. On the HD-18, however, the serial number is not present on the left side. Instead, it's on the right side. We can see that both of the bolt carriers have about the same profile. They're both the modern bolt carriers that have the extended rear ends as opposed to the thin tail. You'll also notice on the HD-18 that there is a hole drilled here, whereas there's no hole drilled on the bolt carrier for the Tiger. I do have another bolt carrier from a more recent SVD, and this one does have the hole drilled on the bolt carrier here. I believe this is like a drainage hole for whether it's water or dirt or whatever it might be that gets in the bolt carrier. It can like come out and not junk up the system. But we do notice here that the profile on this particular block here is different. So it's a lot thinner on the Russian ones, whereas the HD-18 is a lot beefier. However, I have seen other modern SVD bolt carriers that do have this larger machine cut here. So it's pretty much more equivalent to some of the more recent modern spec, early to mid 2000s, I would say, spec bolt carriers, which I believe, once again, I believe that the reason for this is because FÉG has the data packets, probably a mid 2000s or early 2000s data packet for the SVD that they obtained before they went under, and then new FÉG, of course, as we know, acquired that IP and all of their data packets and all of the existing parts that they had manufactured prior to closing down. So next thing we're going to look over is the bolt. The bolts here we see are pretty much identical. The stems look the same. In my previous videos, and many of you saw, we did a kind of a comparison where we took calipers and measured out the stems, measured it against modern SVD bolt carriers and bolts as well. In fact, I have another bolt here. And we pretty much were able to figure out that there's really no difference between these bolts. They're all Russian spec. So here is the Tiger. Mine's a little dirty. Here's the HD-18. Here's another Russian bolt that we have. Stems are the same. This Russian military one has a free floating pin. That was pretty typical of the military rifles. Tigers, however, they spring-loaded them. Then this is my Tiger one, it's spring-loaded. So if I press on that, you can see it coming out there. Same thing with the HD-18, it's spring-loaded. We can look at the receivers as well. We already did a caliper test on them. We saw that the receivers are pretty much identical, but there really is no difference. They're both slab-sided receivers. The indent marks are machined, and the shape of them are exactly the same on the HD-18 as they are on the Tiger. Really no difference there. One thing we can also really see on the HD18 is just how nice the finish is. It's very similar to the finish on the Tiger. My Tiger finish, of course, is a lot more rough, a little bit more worn. This is my beater Tiger. I use it a lot at events, so it's seen a lot of use. I like to use this gun. I like to shoot this gun. So needless to say, you'll notice that it'll be a little bit more dirty than the HD18. And the manufacturer markings are also engraved on this rifle. Serial number is also engraved, and there's a proof mark right there on the front. Something to note here is that later Tigers do have this etched on type method that they use now at Kalashnikov Concern, where it's not fully engraved. They like etch off the paint essentially. Whereas the FÉG 18, they painted it on. So the selector markings here are Hungarian style 0-1 painted on. The markings here are all painted on. Serial number is dot matrix, and mine does have a proof mark in the front as well on this one. It's the Hungarian half moon. If we flip the rifles over, we can kind of see what the other side looks like. We see the machining on the rail here is pretty much the same. They both have the same step from the receiver up onto the shelf that essentially has the scope rail machined onto. You see it's the same on the Tiger here. The machining isn't as nice on the Tiger as it is on the HD18, but we do see how there's a step here that comes up, and then there's the actual rail here. We see the step here, comes up, and then the rail. So very much the same, but the machining on the HD18 is much nicer overall. They both use the modern bump rivet, so that goes into the receiver here, and the bolt interfaces with that rivet and it allows it to rotate into place. That's also the same on the Tiger. Older SVDs did not have that prior to the 90s. Moving forward, let's go ahead and take our handguard retainers off. Originally on mine, that was really difficult to do. I've managed to work it in, so now I can take it off a little easier, but it was very tight when I first got the rifle. Okay, so we got all this apart. We'll first look at the up rods here. We can see here the Tiger up rod is quite a bit thicker on the collar there compared to the HD18, which is slightly thinner. Comparing the HD18 up rod, however, to a modern one, they're the same. You can see right there, the profile is the same on them. So it looks like they did go with the modern data packets here, as we see, as that was a 2003 op rod, and that matches the op rod for the HD18. Looking at the gas regulators, this is a Soviet gas regulator. This is the HD18. The HD18 is just about the same. There's no difference between the two. The HD18, however, does have the numbers 1 and 2 painted on. These are only 2-position gas regulators. I don't know, someone said there were 3. I think it was Mac. Tim, which they're not. They're only 2-position, either off or on. And the Soviet one, same thing. It's 2-position. The Soviet one, however, you'll notice that the positions are engraved. So we have 1 right here and then 2 right here, and they're engraved into the actual regulator here. Pistons are different. You'll see here on the Tiger just how different it is. It's knurled on the back, whereas the piston on the HD18 is smooth. However, I have seen a different kit, a more modern SVD kit that also has the same style gas piston on it. So once again, they went with a modern spec. Moving forward, we have handguard retainers. There was no difference between the two. The embossing and everything is the same on both the Tiger and on the HD18. The retainers are the same. Nothing really to see here. Moving forward on the gas block, they both have commercial style gas blocks with the sling loop. That is a separate piece here. The Russians did change that into a 1-piece sling loop on the side here. The commercial ones are a lot larger, probably to fit commercial slings in a lot easier. The HD-18, however, does have a slightly different block than the Tiger. As the Tiger, you can see here, the machine cut's swooped here, it's graduated, as opposed to the HD-18, which has a sharp cut on the gas block here. So it's cut all the way deep to the block itself. We do see that difference. However, there is something to be said about this because modern SVD gas block also has this. So this is from a early 2000s Russian kit, and we see here that it's the same cut as on the HD-18 where it's sharp. However, this being a military block, we see that the sling loop is integrated onto the block itself. That's not the case on any of the commercial rifles. Looking at the barrels here, we see on the HD-18, there is a serial stamp on the bottom. For whatever reason, there are actually two. These are supposedly Lothar Walther barrels. I have measured the profile on both of these barrels. We were originally told that the HD-18 barrels were going to be thicker. They're not. They're actually the same profile. We did up calipers and we measured them out. And the HD-18 profile is actually exactly the same as the SVD profile. So there's actually no difference between it and the SVD or the Tiger. There's also no difference between the HD-18 and the military spec profile barrels. I went ahead and I have drawings for the original spec for the Russian military version. Measured it against the HD-18 and it's actually the same. So that's nice because that means we can create period correct, military correct style clones using this platform. On the Tiger, it has a proof mark stamped down here. That's pretty typical of Russian barrels. They usually stamp all over the bottom here, stamp along the base. You don't really have that on the HD-18. These are supposedly also cold hammer forged barrels. That's what we've been told. Supposedly Lothar Walther cold hammer forged barrels. We know it's chrome lined too. A slight difference on the barrel between the HD-18 and the Tiger is between the gas block and the handguard retainer. On the Tiger, there really is nothing between them. On the HD-18 barrel, however, we have some proof stamps here. So what these proof marks here is 21, that's the year, 2021. The stamp next to it is the proofing house mark. That is a CIP mark, a CIP proofing house mark. That is the Hungarian CIP house. And then past that, you'll see it's CIP over N. That is the mandatory proofing requirement needed in order to proof this barrel. So it's a CIP over N proofing. The proofing house is the Hungarian proofing house, and the year was 2021. So that's nice to have. We know that these were proofed in Hungary. We know that these barrels are good to go. So that's always a nice thing to have. Moving forward, we can go ahead and look at the muzzles here. We see on the SVD, originally there was this neuter block. I put the European spec front sight block muzzle brake combo in order to try to emulate the SVD-M. I think with a shorter barrel, this just looked a little better, in my opinion, with the Tiger. On the Hungarian HD-18, however, we do have a full-length barrel. So that means that if we want to emulate a proper full-sized fixed stock rifle, we can do so with the long flash hider, which I will probably do. What's nice is when I pulled off the old front sight block here, is this profile is the same and correct to Russian spec, which means that a Russian style front sight block will actually fit on this without any problems. It starts getting a little tighter as you push it on. That's normal. You could just keep hammering it all the way down. You can use a rubber mallet. It should be fairly simple to get it all the way down. I've done that many times in the past with rifles. Or of course you could use a press and press it all the way back down, but it's usually easy enough to just use a rubber mallet and you can push it all the way down and then just punch your pins back in place and you have the correct military front sight block. One more thing about the barrels here is that the Tiger has a 240 millimeter twist rate, whereas the HD-18 actually has a 320 millimeter twist rate, which is the same as the original. So it looks like what FEG has done was they went with the original twist rate. From what they say, it was Lothar Walther they contracted the barrels out for. So they probably went ahead and got Lothar Walther to go ahead and get them barrel blanks that had twist rates of 320 millimeters. They say they contracted out another company to actually turn the barrel to spec. And here we have the correct style barrels for these rifles, which is really nice. So the fact that we do have these outsourced barrels, kind of puts to rest this whole conspiracy that these were rebranded Tigers, as this barrel isn't a Tiger barrel. Just based on the twist rate, we actually know that this here is a new production barrel that was made to a new specification in order to get us essentially a twist rate that was more closer to the originals. Last but not least, we have the scopes. So right here, the Hungarian scope, you'll see, is different. It doesn't have the same profile as the Russian Tiger scope that it has. However, they were both sourced from the same company, I do believe. I know that for Tiger exports, they couldn't actually export MPZ or Ishmash-made scopes, so they actually went ahead and had a Belarusian company produce these. It's Zenit Belimo was the manufacturer of these particular scopes. These were designated as the PSO 1 M2s. That was their particular designation. Whereas these here are, I believe, they look identical to the commercial Zenit Belimo PSOP scopes. And I'm like 99% sure that's what these are. I'm not convinced that FEG made these. And the reason for that is because we know that when they were originally coming out with the buyer's list for these particular rifles, they were saying, oh, well, scopes are optional. We don't actually have scopes for these rifles. And they essentially needed to outsource to get these scopes, is what I believe ended up happening. These are identical to the Zenit Belimo ones from Belarusia, so I'm pretty sure they just had a contract done with them, and they had these made for these particular rifles. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's actually really great that we have that. I did show this previously, how in my scope here, they forgot a battery in it. They did provide regular AA batteries that you could have, but mine did come with a battery in the scope itself, and it's definitely not Hungarian. The PSOP that these came with have a nice AA adapter here, as you just saw me pull out a AA battery out of it. Typically they didn't have that. They looked like that, and they had a proprietary Russian cell battery that they used, but we get these nice little adapters that work for us here in the United States, so that's always nice. The eye cup here, the eyepiece, is different than the Russian ones. I don't have mine. I think it's buried in a box somewhere, but it is thinner. It definitely feels thinner. Because I believe, once again, that these are just the commercial Zenit Belimo scopes that they outsource to issue with these particular rifles. So that pretty much covers everything. I just want to reiterate that it's nice that we have these clones coming in that are to current Russian military spec. That means that we can create modern clones very easily. This particular rifle, what I want to do is I'm going to have the wood stock, the polymer handguards, and I'm switching my Type 3 dust cover out for a nice Type 2 in order to get that nice mid-90s kind of aesthetic. I really like the mid-90s aesthetic on the SVD, and that's what I'm going for on this. This will look correct for the mid-90s issue style, and I really like that they have these modern SVD rifles out. Maybe in the future they'll come out with some classic style with the lightning cuts on the outside. That would be really cool to see and have. Once again, there's the conspiracy theories that these were actually completely Russian made and they were Tigers that were rebranded. I don't think so. FEG of Hungary has said that they're going to come out and produce more of these rifles. I've talked to other members who now have their rifles, and we've basically been able to confirm some of the differences that I saw on my rifle compared to my Tiger and compared to other SVD parts. So, I'll be really happy to see more of these rifles coming in through FEG Defense. FEG Defense does seem to have a U.S. presence now. Looks like they're actually starting up an operation in the United States. Considering that, we can be pretty confident that they, have the data packets, they have the modern data packets, and they're producing new modern spec rifles. I'll reiterate this again because I think this is important. We've seen this happen before here in the United States with Kalashnikov USA, where they're producing identical Saiga 9s and Saiga MK103s, which are essentially the same as the Vityaz and the AK103. These rifles are pretty much identical down to the T to the Russian rifles because they obtained the technical data packets from Russia before sanctions hit.
Another good example of this is in Venezuela, where Kalashnikov concern licensed production of the AK-103 and the AK-104 using the technical data packets. Venezuela currently produces identical copies of these rifles using the data and any type of machinery that Kalashnikov concern may have actually given to them.
I think this is important because that way we can have essentially nice Russian spec guns now that don't have any ties to Kalashnikov concern and really give us more options on the AK market in a time when the AK market is just so dry. The whole comblock market has just been absolutely hammered. And to see these new products that don't rely on Kalashnikov concern is nice to have, because now we can enjoy these without having to worry about Russian sanctions. So that's all I have for you today. I hope you all were able to enjoy this. I hope this was informative. And as always, have a good one.
Вдох, закрой глаза, я с тобою навсегда. Выдох, сердце стук, ровным боем режет слух. Вдох, вся боль пройдет, календарь замедлит ход. Выдох, слезы спрячь и, пожалуйста, не плачь. Вдох, закрой глаза, я с тобою навсегда. Думали, что невозможно все сломать одним движением. Сердце сокрушить несложно под психическим давлением. Есть всего одна возможность корень погубить мучение. Просто закрой глаза и дождись меня. Вдох, закрой глаза, я с тобою навсегда. Выдох, сердце стук, ровным боем режет слух. Вдох, вся боль пройдет, календарь замедлит ход. Выдох, слезы спрячь и, пожалуйста, не плачь. Ты прости меня за то, что я не могу быть рядом. Выпусти чувства прочь, не сдерживай в сердце, прошу, не надо. Время призывает случиться куда-то, сами наверняка своей виноваты. Вокруг у нас варианта, шансы слишком близки к нулю. Без тебя крути сорвется на части, лица на коленях от страсти. Я мечтаю лишь о капельке счастья и шепну: я тебя люблю. Я тебя люблю. Вдох, закрой глаза, я с тобою навсегда. Выдох, сердце стук, ровным боем режет слух. Вдох, вся боль пройдет, календарь замедлит ход. Выдох, слезы спрячь и, пожалуйста, не плачь. Вдох, закрой глаза, я с тобою рядом. Закрой глаза, нет, не плачь, не надо. Закрой глаза, я с тобою рядом. С тобою рядом, рядом. Тишина, тусклый свет, одиночество, блеск, слеп, отчаянный крик. Никого рядом нет, все забудь, все откинь. Оглянись, посмотри, никогда не поймут, почему мы одни. Объяснять не всерьез, не старайся, зачем. У не всех и без нас слишком много проблем. Ты во сне, наяву, как в тумане, глаза ненавижу и люблю. Слезы и кровь не опасно, ведь значит мы живы. С тобою мы живы, ты слышишь меня? И нас не осудят, они не ответят, они не узнают о том, как я руки о них разбиваю. Не чувствуя страха, не чувствуя боли, но мы же живые. Тогда почему же я умираю без тебя? Вдох, закрой глаза, по щеке бежит слеза. Выдох, сердце стук, дрожь по телу, тремор рук. Вдох, мы с тобой связаны одной судьбой. Выдох, обними и, пожалуйста, живи. Вдох, закрой глаза, я с тобою навсегда. Вдох, закрой глаза, я с тобою навсегда.